Chapter 1. The rain in Seattle didn't fall, it hung in the air like a wet, gray wool blanket, clinging to the floor-to-ceiling glass of the 42nd floor of Vance and Sterling. For Julian Vance, 32 and drowning in the sterile, fluorescent purgatory of corporate compliance law, the weather was a perfect mirror of his soul. He sat at his sprawling mahogany desk, surrounded by mountains of leather-bound ledgers and glowing dual monitors displaying the dry, suffocating text of a multi-billion-dollar tech acquisition. This was his life, a life meticulously mapped out before he was even born. His father, Arthur Vance, was a titan of the city's legal elite, a man whose shadow stretched across the entire Pacific Northwest. At Vance and Sterling, Julian's last name was less a badge of honor and more a gilded shackle. He was meant to be the crown prince, the flawless successor in a bespoke three-piece suit. Except Julian was entirely empty. He spent his 80-hour workweeks rubber-stamping corporate mergers and shielding mega-corporations from environmental liabilities, completely burying the idealistic investigative journalist he had wanted to be in his 20s. He had traded his conscience for a corner office, and the trade was eating him alive. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass, hollow eyes, a tight jaw, a ghost wearing a designer tie. At exactly 4 p.m., the heavy oak door to his office clicked open. His assistant, Clara, a quiet, efficient woman whom Julian had hired mostly because her name reminded him of a past he desperately tried to forget, stepped in. She carried the afternoon mail delivery, dropping a stack of manila folders onto his desk with a soft thud. The signatures for the tech merger need to be finalized by 5, Mr. Vance, she reminded him, her voice monotone. Your father expects you in the main boardroom right after. He emphasized that any delay is unacceptable. Thank you, Clara. Just leave them, Julian murmured, not looking up from his screen. As she exited, closing the door behind her with a soft, deliberate click, Julian reached for the stack. But as he moved the manila folders aside, his hand froze. Resting beneath them was a single, square envelope. It stood out like a drop of oil on silk. It was heavy, textured cardstock of a deep, midnight blue that seemed to absorb the office's artificial light. There was no return address, no postmark, and no corporate stamp. On the front, his name and the firm's private suite address were written in an elegant, flowing calligraphy using metallic silver ink. Julian frowned, a faint prickle of curiosity breaking through his habitual numbness. He picked up a silver, monogrammed letter opener and carefully slid it through the top crease. He pulled out a single sheet of matching midnight blue paper. As his eyes scanned the silver script, the air left his lungs so fast his chest ached. Julian, they told you I died in that car crash 12 years ago. They lied. Your father paid the coroner, bought the police report, and buried an empty casket in the family plot. I am alive, Julian. But I am running out of time. The truth about what happened the night of the accident, and what your father's firm has been hiding in the Helios project, is locked in safety deposit box 414 at the Meridian Trust downtown. The key is where we had our first kiss. Don't trust anyone, especially not the man you call father. Forever yours, Clara. Julian's hands began to shake violently, the heavy cardstock rattling in his grip. The silver ink blurred and swam before his eyes. Clara, not his assistant, but Clara Montgomery. His college sweetheart. The woman whose laugh used to fill his chest with warmth, the brilliant, fiercely independent student who had been the only woman he had ever truly loved. 12 years ago, he had been told she died in a fiery, single-vehicle wreck on Interstate 5 while driving home from his family's summer estate in the dead of night. He had attended her funeral. He had wept over her grave. He had let his father console him, letting the grief harden him into the compliant shell of a man he was today. Julian, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. The voice shattered his trance. Julian jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. His assistant had re-entered the room, holding a steaming mug of coffee he hadn't asked for. Her eyes weren't on the coffee, they were locked onto the deep blue paper in his hands. Julian's survival instincts took over. He instinctively flipped the midnight blue letter face down on his desk, covering it with a manila folder, though his hands were still visibly trembling. I'm fine, he choked out, his voice sounding thin, distant, like it belonged to someone else. Just a sudden, blinding headache. I need to take the rest of the day. Clara looked at him, her eyes narrowing slightly with an intensity that sent a chill down his spine. But your father scheduled the final briefing on the tech merger at 5. He was very specific that you need to present the liability waivers. You know how he gets when you try to leave early. Cancel it, Julian said, his voice instantly sharpening into an edge he didn't know he possessed. He stood up, knocking his leather chair backward. He snatched the letter from beneath the folder, stuffed it into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, and grabbed his overcoat. Tell him I was violently ill. Tell him whatever you want. He didn't wait for her response. He bolted past her, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. As the elevator doors began to slide shut, he caught a glimpse of Clara standing by his desk, already on her desk phone, her eyes tracking him with cold calculation. He had to move, and he had to move now. Chapter 2. The wind bit at Julian's face as he burst through the revolving glass doors of the skyscraper and stepped onto the slick, rain-washed Seattle pavement. The city felt louder, sharper, more menacing than it had 10 minutes ago. Every passing face looked like a threat, every black SUV idling at the curb looked like a tale. His mind raced as he walked briskly down the block, desperately trying to process the impossibility of the letter. The key is where we had our first kiss. It wasn't a restaurant, a theater, or a commercial place. It was a secret they shared. It was the old, abandoned glass greenhouse at the far, overgrown edge of the Washington Park Arboretum. They had snuck in there during a midnight thunderstorm in the spring of their sophomore year at UW, hiding from the campus police, laughing in the dark surrounded by dying ferns and leaking glass panels. Julian hailed a yellow cab, practically throwing himself into the backseat. Washington Park Arboretum, the north entrance. And please, hurry, he told the driver, throwing a $50 bill over the seat. As the cab crawled through the gridlocked downtown traffic, Julian stared out the window, his mind spinning backward in time. If Clara was alive, whose body had he buried? Who was in that casket? And more terrifyingly, why would his father, a man obsessed with legacy and control, spend millions of dollars to orchestrate the fake death of a 20-year-old college student? The letter mentioned something called the Helios Project. Julian had seen that name before, buried deep within the firm's highly encrypted, restricted archives he, as a junior partner, was strictly forbidden from accessing. He pulled out his phone to check the firm's remote portal, but before he could log in, a massive red warning banner flashed across the screen: access denied. Account suspended by administrator. His father had already cut his digital ties. 30 minutes later, the cab pulled up to the rainy, desolate edge of the park. Julian stepped out, the mud instantly ruining his expensive leather dress shoes. He didn't care. He tore through the overgrown, rain-soaked paths of the arboretum, the branches scratching at his face. The old greenhouse loomed out of the thick afternoon mist like a giant, rusted skeleton of iron and shattered glass. He stepped inside through a broken doorframe, the sharp crunch of glass beneath his shoes sounding like breaking bones in the silence. The air inside smelled of damp earth, rot, and old rain. He walked toward the center of the structure, where a massive, long-dead ficus tree stood in a crumbling, circular concrete planter. He remembered sitting on the edge of that planter with her, sharing a cheap bottle of wine, her head resting on his shoulder. Julian knelt into the mud beside the planter. He reached his hand into a hollow, rotting knot in the tree's ancient trunk, blind with desperation and praying he wasn't losing his mind. His fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. His breath hitched. He pulled his hand out. Clutched in his palm was a heavy, tarnished brass key stamped with the number 414. Wrapped around the key with a rubber band was a small, sleek black USB flash drive. Suddenly, the sharp, deliberate crunch of footsteps echoed from the main entrance of the greenhouse. Julian spun around, his pulse skyrocketing. 2 men in dark, tailored overcoats stood in the shattered doorway, silhouetted against the gray afternoon light. They didn't look like muggers or street criminals, they had the rigid, dangerous, military-esque posture of high-end private security operatives. The kind of men his father hired to handle sensitive corporate logistical issues. Mr. Vance, the taller one said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection or emotion. Your father requested that you return to the office immediately. He's very concerned about your sudden departure. And he'd highly appreciate it if you handed over whatever it is you just pulled out of that tree. Julian's blood ran completely cold. He was being watched. His father hadn't just noticed his absence, they had tracked his phone's GPS before disabling his account. He was completely trapped. "Tell my father I'm taking the night off," Julian said, his voice shaking as he slowly backed up toward a shattered rear window at the back of the greenhouse. The two men didn't argue. They simply advanced, their right hands moving smoothly inside their tailored coats toward hidden holsters. Julian didn't wait to see what they were drawing. He turned, vaulted through the shattered window frame, ripping the sleeve of his expensive suit jacket on a jagged shard of glass, and sprinted blindly into the dense, dark woods of the park. Behind him, two suppressed, heavy thuds echoed through the trees, the silenced gunshots tearing through the wet foliage just inches from his head. He ran faster than he ever had in his life, fueled by pure, unadulterated adrenaline, slipping in the mud, scrambling up embankments, until he burst onto a busy side street half a mile away. Panting and terrified, he threw himself into the open doors of a passing city bus, disappearing into the anonymous, urban gloom of the Seattle grid. Chapter 3. Julian holed up in a seedy, pay-by-the-hour motel on the neon-lit outskirts of Highway 99, far away from his luxury high-rise apartment and the watchful eyes of his father's network. The room was wretched, it smelled heavily of stale cigarettes, cheap bleach, and despair. He locked the deadbolt, pulled the stained curtains shut, and sat on the edge of the squeaking mattress. With trembling fingers, he opened his laptop. He bypassed his firm's tracking network by disabling his Wi-Fi entirely, preventing any remote wipes, and plugged the black USB drive into the port. A prompt immediately popped up on the screen, demanding an encryption password. Julian stared at the blinking cursor. There was a password hint at the bottom, "Our Song." A bitter, emotional wave washed over him. He typed in the title of the Peter Gabriel track they used to listen to on repeat in his rusted college sedan, "In Your Eyes," skipping the spaces. He hit enter. The drive clicked open instantly. Inside was a single, high-definition video file and a massive, encrypted spreadsheet ledger. Julian clicked the video file. The screen flickered with a bit of digital noise, and then a face appeared. Julian's breath caught in his throat, a silent sob tearing out of him. It was Clara. She looked older, her face leaner, tired, with a thin, pale scar running down her left cheekbone. But her piercing, intelligent green eyes were exactly as he remembered them. She was sitting in a dimly lit room somewhere, looking directly into the camera lens. "Julian," she spoke, her voice trembling but filled with a terrifying resolve. "If you're watching this, it means you found the key, and it means you're alive. I'm so sorry, Julian. I'm so sorry I let you think I was dead for 12 years. I had no choice. If I had stayed, if I had tried to contact you, they would have finished the job. Your father's firm isn't just handling legalities for the tech and medical sectors. Vance and Sterling built and manages the Helios project. Helios isn't a real estate development, Julian. It's a massive, highly illegal human trials pharmaceutical ring. 12 years ago, when I was interning at the courthouse, I accidentally found the real financial ledger. I found out they were testing experimental, highly toxic neurological compounds on unhoused people and marginalized communities in exchange for fast-tracked corporate funding from overseas syndicates. They destroyed lives in the dark, and your father drew up the non-disclosure agreements with blood. I was young, naive. I confronted your father in his office. I thought he would fix it. Instead, that very night, his fixers ran my car off the road on I-5. I survived by a miracle, crawling out of the wreckage before the car caught fire. When I woke up in a private clinic under a fake name, a sympathetic nurse whispered to me that men in suits were outside, planning to terminate my life support. I escaped into the night, faked my identity, and went into deep hiding. The ledger on this drive is the digital backup, but digital files can be wiped, altered, or dismissed in court by a man as powerful as Arthur Vance. The physical copies, the actual, original paper contracts with your father's real, unforgeable signatures, are in the Meridian Trust Vault, Box 414. Take them to the federal prosecutors, Julian. End this nightmare. Free the victims, and please, free us both. The video cut sharply to black, leaving Julian sitting in the dim, flickering light of the motel room. Tears streamed freely down his face, dripping onto his torn, ruined suit. His entire life was a lie. His wealth, his prestigious career, his family legacy, the pride he thought he felt for his family name, all of it was built on a foundation of human suffering, corporate murder, and the forced exile of the woman he loved. Suddenly, a sharp knock rattled the motel door. Julian's heart stopped. He froze, looking at the door. Through the thin gap in the curtains, he saw the silhouette of a woman. It wasn't one of the suit-clad operatives. "Julian, open the door," a voice whispered. It was his assistant, Clara. Julian slowly approached the door, his hand on the lock. "How did you find me?" "I built the firm's secondary tracking protocols, Julian," she said softly through the wood. "I didn't tell your father where you are. I'm the one who slipped that blue envelope into your mail stack. I've been working with the underground network trying to keep Clara Montgomery safe. But your father knows you went to the Arboretum. His men are sweeping every motel on this strip. You have until sunrise before they find this room. Get to the bank." Julian stared at the door as her footsteps faded away. The web was deeper than he could have ever imagined. The grief that had paralyzed him for over a decade completely crystallized. It transformed into a cold, burning, architectural rage. He didn't just want to survive anymore. He wanted to destroy his father's empire. Chapter 4. The next morning, the rain returned with a vengeance, washing over the towering granite facade of the Meridian Trust Bank downtown. Julian walked through the grand, marble-pillared lobby. He had pulled a cheap black baseball cap low over his eyes and wore a heavy canvas jacket over his torn clothes to hide his appearance. He approached the high-security desk guarding the subterranean vaults. Using his knowledge of the firm's operational logistics, he presented the heavy brass key alongside a forged, high-priority corporate authorization form utilizing his father's private firm credentials. The elderly vault teller scanned the document, looked at Julian's tense face, and nodded, buzzing open the heavy iron gate. "Right this way, Mr. Vance." The teller led him deep into the bowels of the building, into a massive, heavily reinforced steel room lined with thousands of glittering, stainless steel safety deposit boxes. The teller located box 414, inserted the bank's master key, allowed Julian to turn his brass key, and then bowed politely. "I'll leave you to your privacy, sir." The heavy steel door swung shut, locking Julian inside the private viewing cubicle. Julian pulled out the long metal box and lifted the lid. Inside lay a thick, leather-bound folder. He opened it, his eyes devouring the contents. It was all there: clinical trial reports, lists of deceased test subjects, bank routing numbers to offshore accounts, and at the bottom of every single page, the bold, arrogant, unmistakable signature of Arthur Vance. "It's a beautiful piece of evidence, isn't it? Almost poetic." Julian froze, every muscle in his body locking up. The heavy vault door behind him hadn't just clicked, it had swung wide open. Standing in the doorway, completely blocking his exit, was Arthur Vance. He looked immaculate, dressed in a flawless charcoal overcoat, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his expression one of mild, patriarchal disappointment rather than anger. Flanking him were the same two private security operatives from the greenhouse, their hands resting ominously near their belts. Behind them stood Julian's assistant, Clara, her face entirely unreadable. "Father," Julian whispered, his voice dangerously low, his fingers tightening around the leather folder, pressing it hard against his chest. "Did you really think you could outmaneuver me, Julian? In my own city, on my own grid?" Arthur sighed, taking a slow, measured step into the vault, his leather gloves clicking against the polished floor. "I built an empire for you, you ungrateful boy. Everything I did, including discarding that meddling, idealistic girl 12 years ago, was to protect our family name and ensure your future wealth. She was a liability to the legacy. She was a human being. They were all human beings." Julian shouted, his voice exploding off the steel deposit boxes, echoing violently in the confined space. "You're not a businessman, father. You're a monster. You're a murderer." "I am a realist," Arthur corrected coldly, his eyes turning to flint. He glanced at Julian's assistant. Clara here did an excellent job playing both sides to draw you out. She told you exactly what you needed to hear to bring you right to this vault, with the original documents in hand. Julian looked at his assistant, a profound sense of betrayal washing over him. She met his eyes, but remained silent. And now, reality dictates that you hand over that folder, Arthur continued, extending a gloved hand. You will return to the office, you will sign the tech merger documents, and we will bury this once and for all. You will be the billionaire I raised you to be. If you refuse, well, Julian, tragic, fatal accidents seem to run in our family line. The two operatives stepped forward, their faces blank, their hands drawing suppressed pistols from their coats. Julian looked at his father, the man he had spent his entire life trying to please. Looking at him now, Julian felt absolutely no fear. He felt only a profound, liberating disgust. No, Julian said softly, looking his father dead in the eye. Arthur's face hardened into a mask of pure malice. He gave a slight, dismissive nod to his men. Make it look like a suicide. The pressure of his legal duties was too much for the boy. As the operatives raised their weapons, Julian's assistant suddenly moved with lightning speed. She grabbed the wrist of the closest guard, twisting it violently until his gun dropped to the floor, firing a stray round into the metal boxes with a loud ping. Before the second guard could react, a sudden, loud electronic screech echoed through the vault's intercom system. The heavy, automated emergency doors behind Arthur didn't lock down, they were violently forced backward from the outside, the gears grinding in protest. Standing in the wide corridor outside the vault was a dozen heavily armed federal agents, their tactical vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI. Leading them was a sharp-faced, fierce woman in a trench coat, holding a federal badge high in the air. FBI. Nobody move. Drop your weapons immediately, she roared. Arthur's security operatives, realizing they were completely outgunned and trapped on federal camera feeds, instantly dropped their weapons onto the marble floor and raised their hands in the air. Julian's assistant stepped back, a calm smile finally breaking across her face. I told you I was working with the underground network, Julian, she whispered. I just needed your father to confess on a live federal wire inside a secure federal facility. Arthur Vance froze, his legendary composure completely cracking for the first time in his life. His face turned an ashen white as he looked around the room. What is the meaning of this? I am Arthur Vance. I demand to make a call. Arthur Vance, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, corporate fraud, and racketeering human rights violations, the lead agent declared, her voice cutting through his protests like a scalpel. Julian stepped forward, completely ignoring his father's furious gaze, and handed the heavy leather folder directly to the federal agent. Everything you need to convict him and everyone associated with the Helios project is in here. Julian looked back at his father, who was now being slammed against the stainless steel deposit boxes, his hands forcibly wrenched behind his back into heavy steel handcuffs. You betrayed your own blood, Julian. Arthur roared, his face twisted in a pathetic, desperate mask of shock and fury as he was dragged out of the vault. You destroyed everything I built for you. Julian watched him go, his voice calm, steady, and entirely free. No, father. I saved it. Chapter 5. 3 weeks later. The mighty empire of Vance and Sterling had completely collapsed, shattered by a relentless barrage of federal indictments, media exposes, and asset seizures. The news of the Helios project had rocked the entire nation, leading to dozens of arrests across the legal, political, and medical sectors. Julian had willingly surrendered his own law license, voluntarily exposing his own minor, unwitting involvements in the firm's broader corporate structures to ensure absolute, airtight cooperation with the Department of Justice. He was legally cleared, but he was entirely broke, having walked away from every single cent of his family's tainted wealth. He had nothing left but his name and his freedom. He stood at the very end of a weathered wooden pier on the edge of Lake Washington. The endless Seattle rain had finally, completely stopped, replaced by the pale, stunningly golden warmth of a late spring afternoon. The water was calm, reflecting the clear blue sky above. The silence here was a beautiful, stark contrast to the chaotic noise of the past month. He heard the soft, distinct scuff of sneakers on the wooden planks behind him. Julian didn't turn around immediately. He closed his eyes, terrified that his mind was finally snapping under the stress, terrified that he was dreaming, that the relief he felt was just a cruel illusion. "You look a lot better without that ridiculous three-piece suit, Julian," a soft, familiar, heartbreakingly beautiful voice said. Julian turned around slowly. It was Clara. She wasn't a ghost on a motel laptop screen anymore. She was standing barely 3 feet away from him, wearing a simple denim jacket and jeans, her dark hair blowing gently in the lake breeze. The pale scar on her cheekbone was visible in the sunlight, a beautiful, fierce testament to her survival, her strength, and her reality. Julian closed the distance between them in a single stride, wrapping his arms tightly around her waist. Clara clung to him just as fiercely, burying her face into his shoulder, her hands gripping his jacket as if anchoring herself to the world. For the first time in 12 long, agonizing years, Julian felt his chest fill with genuine, overwhelming warmth. He breathed her in, the scent of rain and pine, realizing that the nightmare was truly over. "We have a lot of lost time to make up for," she whispered against his neck, a tear slipping down her cheek. "We have all the time in the world," Julian replied softly. The midnight blue letter had completely destroyed his life, burning everything he knew to the ground. But as he looked out over the sparkling, sunlit water of the lake, holding the woman he had loved since he was a boy, Julian knew the truth. The letter hadn't just ended his life, it had finally given him a real one to live. The end.